When India gained independence, there was a promise of a completely new, equitable society. But for many, that promise felt hijacked almost immediately. There is a very specific, popular theory of how this betrayal worked. Imagine the country collected 1,000 crores in taxes. The theory goes that corrupt leaders funneled 800 crores directly into their own pockets, leaving a meager 200 crores to share. When you divide that tiny fraction among millions of citizens, the math simply doesn't work. It creates an environment of artificial, brutal scarcity, where surviving on your rightful share is impossible. And when people are starved of basic resources, survival takes over. This structural theft pushed ordinary citizens toward moral compromises. People felt forced to cheat, hoard, or steal just to feed their families. When scarcity becomes the baseline for one generation, it shapes the institutions the next generation inherits. This survival-first mindset eventually became baked into administrative and corporate culture, turning a temporary necessity into a permanent cycle of corruption. It feels like a comic book villain's plot, a few greedy men sitting on giant piles of hoarded cash. But tracking a nation's disappearing wealth reveals a systemic failure far more complicated and far more dangerous than a simple vault of stolen money. To understand where the money actually went, we have to look at the basic mechanics of a national economy. A government's tax pool is rarely distributed as direct cash payouts to citizens, especially not in 1947. India was starting from a staggering deficit. There was virtually no domestic heavy industry, widespread extreme poverty, and a national literacy rate of barely 12%. That theoretical 1,000-crore tax base couldn't be handed out. It had to be poured into massive foundational infrastructure that no single citizen could afford on their own. Things like military defense and the creation of entirely new, heavy industrial sectors. Capital had to be channeled into nationwide electrical grids, public health care, and the endless physical labor required to build and maintain massive public transit networks. But there is a brutal disconnect here. While the government was making these grand macroeconomic investments on paper, the immediate reality for the common person was very different. Millions found themselves living in extreme squalor, wondering what exactly they were free from. So even if the math of the 80-20 cash hoarding conspiracy is historically flawed, the anger behind it is absolutely justified. The feeling that the wealth never reached the ground level is correct. A decentralized administrative drain proves far more effective at depleting national wealth than any individual hoarding cash in a vault. This systemic leakage was the true culprit. Decades later, the highest level of government finally confirmed what the public already knew. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi made a stark admission about how funds were actually moving through the country. He stated that for every rupee dispatched by the central government, only 15 paise reached the intended beneficiary. That is an 85% loss. As money moved down the ladder, it was siphoned off by middlemen and swallowed by corruption. This massive siphoning was incredibly easy to hide because there was zero transparency. Policies were drafted and financial audits were conducted entirely behind closed doors. The public was kept blind to how their taxes were being spent or stolen. This systemic bleeding fueled immense generational frustration. It resulted in mass civic unrest, with desperate citizens taking to the streets, fighting for basic survival, education, and employment. 1 million tiny bureaucratic cuts eventually bled the working class dry, normalizing theft as a standard operating procedure for decades. When you realize the system is built on leaks, the natural reaction is to want to burn it all down, to shut down poorly performing industries, scrap every old rule, and restart the country from scratch. But hitting a hard reset button on an interconnected economy of over 1 billion people is functionally impossible. An overnight shutdown wouldn't punish the corrupt. It would instantly devastate the poorest and most vulnerable populations who rely on those fractured systems to survive. The solution is fixing the pipes, not destroying them. We now have the technological tools to do this. Mechanisms like direct benefit transfers, or DBT, allow the government to send funds digitally, directly into a citizen's bank account, completely bypassing the human middlemen who used to take a cut. And on the legislative side, tools like the Right to Information Act have torn the doors off those closed administrative rooms. It gives any citizen the legal power to audit government spending and demand to see exactly where the money went. Securing the nation's future wealth won't happen by tearing the system down. It requires using these modern tools of transparency to force accountability, to stop being angry victims of a broken system and start being vigilant participants in fixing it.